The Tennessee Supreme Court issued a huge victory for workers nationwide and especially victims of mesothelioma lung cancer and other asbestos-related diseases in a ruling saying a corporation, Alcoa, has a full duty to prevent its employees from going home at the end of the workday in clothes that are contaminated with asbestos fibers. Alcoa, a Fortune 100 company, knew that the families of such workers could be exposed to the tiny, dangerous asbestos fibers that can easily be inhaled if they become airborne. They said the company had and now has an important duty to set precautions for its employees and prevent asbestos exposure. The plaintiff, Amanda Satterfield, was a beautiful 25-year-old young lady who died on January 1st, 2005. Amanda's family continued her lawsuit, suing Alcoa for $10 million in compensatory damages and $10 million in punitive damages, and settled the case in September 2009. Amanda was exposed to asbestos in the late 1970s when she was just a few days old. Born in a premature birth, Amanda had to spend the first 3 months after her birth at a hospital in Knoxville, Tennessee, during which period her father was employed at Alcoa's aluminum plant. Her father was exposed to asbestos on the job. He then visited his baby daughter in the hospital immediately after work wearing the same asbestos-contaminated clothes. The court was surprised at realizing that Amanda was exposed to asbestos from day one of her life thanks to her father's asbestos-contaminated work clothes. Proof being presented at the Supreme Court included Alcoa knew that the air in its factories contained high amounts of asbestos fibers, and workers in the plant were inhaling these fibers that could easily get clogged up in the lungs and lead to lung scarring or inflammation. In fact, Alcoa conducted tests to determine the amount of asbestos fibers on their employees' asbestos-contaminated clothes, and the results were extremely high. It was proven that Alcoa knew that even a small amount of exposure to asbestos fibers could lead to deadly diseases. Also, it was proven that Alcoa knew that by the 1960s, employees who worked near factories or plants that made heavy use of asbestos were at increased risk of asbestos exposure, including their families. In 1972, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration introduced legislation that forbid employees from wearing the same clothes they wore while working around asbestos at factories and plants when going home after work. Alcoa was being sued because it ignored the precautions that OSHA set out to protect employees from asbestos exposure. Alcoa did little or nothing to educate its employees on how to safely work with asbestos and wear protective gear and masks. Alcoa did not warn its employees about the dangers of wearing asbestos-contaminated clothes home after work. The company discouraged the use of on-site bathrooms and did not offer to launder its employees' clothes. Using these facts, the Tennessee Supreme Court decided that under Tennessee law, Alcoa has a duty to prevent foreseeable injury from an unreasonable risk of harm that it had itself created. The Tennessee Supreme Court stated also that in light of the magnitude of the potential harm from exposure to asbestos and the means available to prevent or reduce this harm, we see no reason to prevent carpool members, babysitters, or domestic help from pursuing negligence claims against an employer should they develop mesothelioma after being repeatedly and regularly in close contact with an employee's asbestos-contaminated work clothes over an extended period of time. Today, the Insider Exclusive will go behind the headlines to examine this landmark Tennessee Supreme Court ruling and the lawyer who fought so valiantly for Amanda Satterfield and her family, Greg Coleman. Hi, I'm Steve Murphy, and this is the Insider Exclusive, live from Knoxville, Tennessee, at the law firm of Coleman and Edwards. It's my great pleasure to introduce Greg Coleman of the law firm of Coleman and Edwards. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve.
You had a huge victory with this Satterfield case. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, Steve, it was a case involving the tragic death of a young lady named Amanda Satterfield. Unbeknownst to her, she contracted a disease called mesothelioma from asbestos exposure brought home by her father from Alcoa.
We're going to right now go to an old newsreel of Alcoa talking about how they help America as well as help all of their workers. Let's cut to that right now.
It was natural that the scientists would turn to asbestos, for this is a remarkable mineral. Actually stone, it is made up of tiny but extremely strong and flexible fibers. Being stone, asbestos will not burn. Also created asbestos cement roofing, which has made buildings safer and more durable. This material, available in many types and colors, is not only attractive but fireproof too. This same kind of scientific thinking was applied to the problem of sidewalls for the homes of America. In the development of a better siding material, rigid specifications were set up. It must be attractive, easy to handle, adjustable to architectural design, weatherproof, and rot-proof. Furthermore, it must be safe from the hazards of fire, and above all, free from constant maintenance expense. Combined with Portland cement, these fibers act as a reinforcing agent, just as steel rods are used to reinforce concrete. And too, the great success of asbestos combined with Portland cement in the roofing field made it a natural choice in research for a better siding. So from long testing and experiment, there came asbestos cement siding. Strong and tough, it could be handled and applied like ordinary shingles. It was given every conceivable test. It was absolutely fire safe, for even a torch couldn't burn it. And water couldn't harm it. It withstood all kinds of weather. This material won't rot or decay, so it doesn't need paint to preserve it. However, it can be painted if the homeowner desires. Laboratory tests are only half of the story. The actual use of this material on homes over the years is the final convincing proof. Here is an asbestos siding shingle nearly 15 years old, and here is a brand new one. As you can see, the old shingle is still attractive, still as strong and sturdy as the day it was made. In fact, it is actually denser and harder. And so asbestos cement took its place with other sidewall materials: wood, brick, stucco, and stone.
And here's another ruberoid asbestos cement product. This soffit is stonewall board, made for lifetime use.
Well, we can see that Alcoa is really on the side of all Americans, right? Being a little bit facetious here.
Right.
Okay. Mesothelioma, tell us a little bit about that disease. How does it affect a human being?
Well, Steve, the way it works is the asbestos fiber gets into the lung area and others, either plurally or the peritoneal area of a person's body. And it will sit there for years.
Wow.
And then ultimately it will make itself manifest through cancer, in a very deadly form of cancer called mesothelioma.
We happen to have an animation video of showing the fibers actually going down into a person's lungs, so let's cut to that right now because that explains a lot about that.
When a worker breathes, asbestos fibers enter the mouth and nose. and flow down the air passages deep into the lungs. The fibers lodge in the delicate lung tissue where oxygen is absorbed into the blood. Immune system cells try and break down the asbestos fibers and become damaged and die. Scar tissue forms around the dead cells and spreads as more fibers embed in the lungs. Asbestos fibers can remain in the lungs for long periods, and the scar tissue that results continues to develop for many years after exposure. Eventually, so much scar tissue develops that the lungs stop working. Since the year 2000, more workers have died from asbestos disease than any other workplace injury.
That is some animation video, because it really shows, how those fibers lodge in the lung. So how does the cancer develop from that?
Well, Steve, it's a very horrific way, frankly, to die. It will spread like a lot of cancers that we know of, and it will spread and bring tumors so large that essentially it will restrict every area of the body, and that's essentially what happened to Amanda, causing her demise.
Mm-hmm. What's the life expectancy once you are diagnosed with mesothelioma?
There is none. In other words, it's a terminal disease with no known cure. You try to manage it the best that you can. In this case, Amanda's life expectancy after diagnosis was only a few years. She died at age 25.
Let's talk about Amanda and her case, okay? Tell us exactly how this happened and the progress of this going through.
Well, Amanda was first diagnosed in 2003, and she brought the case after realizing that there may be some connection between her father working at Alcoa, Doug Satterfield, and bringing home asbestos fibers on his clothing to the household, specifically when she was a young girl and was born at UT Hospital as a premature baby.
Right. I think we have a newsreel of her father talking about that, which I want to show right now.
Amanda was a fighter. Amanda was a beautiful girl.
And Doug Satterfield believes his daughter Amanda would be alive if he had not worn asbestos home on his clothes from his job at Alcoa.
I also believe that we have another video clip of Amanda talking about when she was first diagnosed. So I'm going to show that right now on the screen.
Now tell us what happened in July of last year. What did you notice was going wrong?
Well, I noticed I started gaining a lot of weight around the stomach area, but I wasn't eating enough to gain that much weight, but my stomach kept on getting bigger and bigger. And I also noticed that I was getting tired a lot easier, and I didn't understand why. And I just figured, well, it's time for me to go for my regular gynecological checkup, so I just went for a regular gynecological checkup, and that's when she felt the masses and wanted to explore that further and ordered an ultrasound and saw them and referred me to a gynecological oncologist.
Okay, now who was the doctor you first saw, your OBGYN?
Dr. Kimberly Ballard.
And she's the one that ordered and read the ultrasound?
Yes.
And so she referred you to this oncologist, and what was his or her name?
Dr. Kenneth Kofer.
And when did you see him?
I saw him after she had read the test and called me back just days after I had got the results.
And do you recall approximately when it was you saw Dr. Kofer?
Probably as soon as July 30th, because I went to her July 26th.
And what did he do for you?
he ordered exploratory surgery because at first he thought it was ovarian cancer. And he went in and found out that it was not, closed me back up after taking biopsies, and sent them to MD Anderson, which concluded that it was mesothelioma.
When did Amanda and her parents first realize that she had mesothelioma, or that they got the link between Alcoa, where her father worked, the fibers, bringing him home in the work, contaminated clothes, and her disease?
When she was first diagnosed, they had never heard of mesothelioma. But after doing some research, talking with various physicians, and also doing some online research, Steve, they realized that there was a link between asbestos fibers being found in the workplace and being brought home on the clothing. And that's when they realized the possible connection.
Once she was diagnosed, there was a treatment plan that was recommended for her.
Oh, yes.
And I believe that she and her family had to go to Washington, D.C., right?
Yes, sir.
We have a clip of her talking about this treatment plan. It's pretty horrendous, actually, about what they did with it. Let's go to that right now.
So did you ultimately see Dr. Sugarbaker?
Yes, we made plans to go see him, and he said that I was a perfect candidate for the surgery that he performs.
Did he, or what was your understanding this Big Bang surgery was? What did that entail?
The removal of the tumor, along with the colon, rectum, everything to get the tumor out.
And did you have that surgery done?
Yes, I had my rectum, colon, abdominal lining, tumor, complete hysterectomy, gallbladder, all removed.
And when was that done?
November 13th, 2003.
What's your understanding is what caused your cancer?
Asbestos exposure.
Wow, that's really horrible what she had to go through. You knew her family personally. Tell us, in dealing with him and talking about this case, her dad was, quite sad about the fact that he, unbeknownst to him, was bringing home the instrument of her death because Alcoa did not inform the employees that these things could happen. How was that experience?
I can tell you, first as a father myself, but in getting to know Doug and Donna Satterfield, no two finer people on this earth. They were devastated. But what I admired about them, Steve, is their willingness and their courage to keep the fight even after Amanda passed on January 1st, 2005.
And the reason that she brought the lawsuit was not for money, was it?
No. It was to help educate others, because the second-hand exposure or the household exposure cases have not really been that known about until Amanda and other cases have come to the forefront.
Let's talk a little bit about her lawsuit. How did you originally get involved with it and the progression through the court system? Because this went all the way to the Tennessee Supreme Court.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Steve, the way I was contacted was I'd had another case that addressed some issues similar to the Satterfield case, and I was contacted by some lawyers, Mona Wallace and Doug Nickel, and they asked me to assist them in the case. And so I took it from the trial court where the case was dismissed.
Yeah.
We appealed it to the Court of Appeals, was successful in our theories, and then Alcoa appealed it to the Supreme Court, and of course we were successful there as well.
Yeah. And let's talk about some of these theories, because it was dismissed at the trial level.
That's right.
And we all have to admit that, Alcoa is a big employer right here in Knoxville, aren't they?
Yes, sir.
They even have a city named after them, don't they?
They do.
So sometimes that affects judicial decisions, doesn't it? I mean, let's be honest about it.
Steve, we all may think certain things.
Yeah.
Do I know that for certain? No, because I have a lot of respect for our judges.
Yeah.
But I do know that it obviously was a very publicized case, and a case that had a lot of attention both locally and nationally.
Yeah. Now, your theories, your legal theories that you brought up to the appellate court, what were they so that the appellate judges decided, well, wait a minute, maybe the manufacturer is responsible. What were your theories?
Well, Alcoa was not the manufacturer of the asbestos per se, but they had asbestos materials there in their plant.
Yes.
And so our theory with respect to Alcoa was they knew of the dangers. Ever since 1972 and
Yes.
the OSHA regulations came out, they knew from that point forward that if you allowed clothes and related items to be taken home without washing, without cleaning, that there could be exposure to the household because of the failure to keep the clothes clean.
Yeah, when I first read that, I was just amazed that here we are. Amanda she was born what year?
1979.
1979. 1972, OSHA enacted legislation.
Correct.
They didn't make recommendations. They enacted legislation that required companies that dealt with asbestos to do certain kinds of safety procedures.
That's
right?
correct.
What was the thinking on Alcoa's management part that they chose to ignore all of this?
Steve, that's where you scratch your head and you go, what were they thinking? Because clearly there had been a known connection between asbestos and household exposures even before 1972, and that's what prompted OSHA to do what they did.
Right.
The reason why Alcoa chose not to make certain things mandatory or to ensure their employees were asbestos-free in leaving the premises, those are things that make me scratch my head even today with not just Alcoa, but with other companies.
This case was won at the appellate and eventually the Tennessee Supreme Court level.
Yes.
But in analyzing the case, what was Alcoa's lawyers' defense strategy? What was their strategy? Why did they say they weren't liable?
Great question. They said there was no duty from a third-party employer. Because, see, Amanda had never been on Alcoa's premises.
Yeah.
They said that as a company, we don't owe a duty to this household member who's never been on our premises, who's never worked in the plant. So we don't have a duty of care to Amanda Satterfield. The Supreme Court said, oh, no, you're wrong. You do have a duty.
Yeah, and we talked about this before the show, but that gets back to, is this the right way to think for any corporation? Meaning the following. Let's take an example of a plant that is emitting toxic fumes in the neighborhood. There are people that don't work at that plant, right? They may be affected. We've seen cases like the Aaron Brockovich case and all this stuff.
Absolutely.
Where people are affected. So where in their minds do they get this logical thinking that because a person doesn't work at their plant, that they're not held responsible for the damages that might be caused because of the chemicals that they are using?
It's a legal evolution thing, Steve, because a lot of times companies will rely upon laws that don't take into consideration new diseases, new problems, like you said, the toxic fumes.
Yeah.
And sometimes lawyers are required to take those cases up to the highest levels in order to seek justice for their client.
Yeah. This case took 4 years or longer than that?
A total of 6.5 years, all the way through the Supreme Court.
Okay. Now, the Tennessee Supreme Court basically ruled that Alcoa was responsible.
That what they found was that Alcoa owed a duty of care to Amanda, and not just to a household member, but if you can prove that a domestic worker or carpooler or anyone that comes into consistent contact, there can be a duty of care owed by a company.
Now, I understand there are only 2 states in the United States that have that interpretation of that duty, that responsibility. That means there's 48 other states that don't. How come?
Either, number one, because that hasn't been brought to the highest court of that state.
Yeah.
Or number two, some of the other states that have considered it, Steve, have said, no, we don't believe there's enough of a relationship between the company and the household member to forge that kind of duty.
Yeah.
Fortunately, Tennessee, along with New Jersey, and there may be a couple of others very recently, but those are the 2 primary states.
Yeah, I'm curious, how long after this whole thing happened did Alcoa initiate safety measures that OSHA had told everybody they had to do way back in 1972?
Steve, that was a subject of a lot of discussion during the case. We questioned whether they were doing it completely, even as of the time of the decision by the Supreme Court. But there have been some changes that Alcoa has made to make it safer, there's no question, in large part because of Amanda's courage.
How are the Satterfields today?
I think it's fair to say that it's been a bittersweet justice. On the one hand, they're proud of the role that they played along with Amanda in making this issue more known. By the same token, it will never bring back to them their beautiful daughter.
Well, congratulations again. You did an outstanding job. And I know this is a difficult case. This is not your typical case where somebody walks in and they've been hit by a car.
Correct.
This requires a lot of strategy, a lot of thinking, a lot of investment of your time and money. What other kind of cases are you working on that are kind of complex like this, that really have a major impact on a lot of people? You know, not just one individual, but a lot of people, like this case did in helping all workers.
Yes, Steve, and I would be remiss if I didn't thank Mona Wallace and Doug Nickel for their getting me involved in the Satterfield case. But the types of cases that I have ongoing, I represent approximately 18 to 20,000 Alcoa retirees in a class action involving their health care benefits. I also represent around 3,000 retirees from a company called AK Steel, based in Pittsburgh, or based rather in Ohio, but involving some folks around the Pittsburgh area, involving the same issue, retiree medical benefits, because as you know, Steve, in our economy and the workforce in general, health benefits, especially retiree health benefits, are a big issue.
Yes.
And so those are the types of things that I handle on a class action basis. And then I have as well your garden variety, we say, although they're just as important to every other person, either personal injury on a high-end basis, medical malpractice, those sorts of things. Recently settled a case against Jewelry Television, a class action case involving a certain gemstone that was being advertised as one thing, but in fact was another. So that was something that I was involved with that was settled recently.
Do you find that, and you touched on this earlier, do you find that the judges in general are very receptive to expanding this theory of liability, holding corporations responsible for injuries and damages to people because of their products?
I think so, Steve. It's always dependent upon the jurisdiction in the area of the country. Some areas are more open and willing to talk about, okay, does this make sense to hold an employer or a company responsible when their product that they make for money injures someone else? And I think it should be. There should always be a balance. We need companies, we need jobs, but we need responsible companies.
I liked your comment in one of the newsreels. I'm for business everywhere, but responsible business.
That's the point.
And that's great. And I really appreciate you spending time with us today. You're doing outstanding work. There's no question about it. And congratulations very much for the case again. Thanks for watching. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at www.insiderexclusive.com.